Okay, so I did this a long time ago on Grok before Elon Musk made it to where you have to be verified to use it. You could type this prompt into pretty much any chat bot, and it's going to give you similar results, but you have to make sure that you tell it to include his government ownership in Intel, the golden share, and everything, because it seems to overlook that, which honestly are some of the most important aspects of his policy that are in opposition to market capitalism, right? So go through all of Trump's proposed and enacted policies, including his industrial policy, and compare them to Austrian school free market economics. You could probably put Chicago school, which would be Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and everything, and get a fairly similar result. So maybe I'll do that as well. Of course, if you have studied this, you don't really need a chat bot to do this, but it's interesting. If you do it on Grok, it gives you the same results, right? I mean, they're all kind of trained similarly, but maybe Grok would be a little bit more accepted by these MAGA socialists and whoever because they think all the other ones are biased or whatever. But here's his overall grade that I got from Claude, which I do prefer a little bit more than ChatGPT these days. But they gave him a D plus. I'd probably give him an F. But so his free market capitalist score was 28, and his state interventionist slash socialist tendency was 72. I cut off the top of this, but the protectionist tariffs, direct government equity of private companies, nascent sovereign wealth fund, state capitalist industrialist policy that Mises and Hayek would flatly condemn. Obviously. But like I said, if you know this stuff, even if you know Chicago school, you would know that this is all state interventionism, corporate subsidies, government taking outright ownership in certain corporations. And right, it doesn't have to be 100%. Any percentage of this is in opposition to free market economics. And Intel especially was the first one, if I do recall correctly, that was the first one they did. And, that was because Intel was failing. And Biden subsidized them, and then Trump comes in and says, oh, well, we got to get a return on our so-called investment. And really, it's like, no, dude, they gave him the subsidies. If you don't want to be, to me, it's like, just let it fail. That was it. No more subsidies, no more so-called government ownership stake, because how long is that going to last? And then they're just going to keep pumping money into these corporations to keep them floating, which is what they do. So here's his overall scorecard according to Claude. Industrial policy obviously gets an F. Trade policy, he gets a D. Deregulation, they gave him an A. Is it really that drastic? Yeah, it's always good, but the way that deregulation in theory anyway is always good, but the way that they work this is they just deregulate certain aspects of corporate policy to help the corporations, which theoretically should trickle down, as they say, into the economy generally. But what they do then is they inflate the currency, which it's like a tag team against the regular consumer, right? Deregulation for corporations is theoretically good, but when they inflate the currency and it hurts all the poor and the less wealthy, it's more in benefit for the corporations in both areas. Government size, they gave him a B. But technically, really, what has he done? The government is so huge and needs so much money. His very minor deregulation and slashing certain corporate taxes is really inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, especially when he printed up $2 trillion in the CARES Act, and then Biden came in and printed a bunch of more money and all that other stuff. Taxation, he gets a C. Of course, this is against, as it says, Austrian school principles, Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard. Free trade, voluntary exchange, sound money, which, of course, he does not believe. He does not understand money. He does not believe in sound money. He believes in government fiat. And that's why he keeps wanting the Federal Reserve to lower the interest rate to pump more money into the economy, because he thinks that's a good thing to keep the economy going. And then he goes up there and he says, I don't want housing prices to fall. But he does. It's like, what are you even talking about, dude? Like, he's only looking at it from the side of the corporations and the investors, which even that is bad for most investors. It's only going to be good for the people who hold the most property, that the prices keep going up. But it's going to get to the point where, because people can't buy, that's also bad for the people who hold the property, right? Who are trying to sell their property. So So they're looking at it as like, oh, look, my property value went up. But it only went up because they printed all this fake money. Your property value didn't actually go up. The value of your dollar decreased. Right. So, and it says here, like I said, it missing from version 1 substantially lowered the overall score because it didn't include his industrial policies as regards to U.S. Steel and everybody else. So, yeah, this rhetoric that they're using here against the communists, like the democratic socialists, who obviously I'm against as well, they're just scapegoats though, because Trump himself is a socialist. They like to call it state capitalism, but I mean, state capitalism is essentially socialism. When the state starts taking ownership in companies and starts directing the economy and managing the economy through tariffs and other trade controls and messing with the money supply, that is essentially the essence of socialism. So there's really no fundamental distinction in philosophy. There's a distinction in scale, in the sense that Marxism is basically totalitarianism, and what Trump is doing is it's more like, I guess you could call it state capitalism. To me, because the underlying foundational premise is the same of state intervention and state control and management of the economy, I just call it all socialism. It's not Marxism. I don't call him a Marxist, though I do have a meme that I made where it's quoting the Communist Manifesto. One of the planks in the Communist Manifesto says that the state should extend its ownership of factories and instruments of production, which is basically what Trump is doing. And it says wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, and that's kind of what's happening. It's not the way that the USSR's socialist revolution took place, where the state took over everything in one fell swoop. It's more like the Fabian conspiracy theory of the state gradually taking by degrees capital and putting it in the state's hands. Now, he's not directly confiscating, right? So that might be a big confusing point for these MAGA fools, because he's not even just outright confiscating wealth. He's having the government buy in, so to speak, into these companies. But fundamentally, it's the same economically, right? The state has an ownership stake. They're not necessarily controlling, though they are in some aspects, like with the U.S. Steel so-called deal. He has appointed 2 government agents to oversee U.S. Steel to make sure that they abide by the stipulations that the government has imposed on that deal. And they've already used it to, they were going to shut down a plant in Illinois, and the government said, no, you can't shut down that plant. So it's like, they talk about these zombie companies, and that's basically what he's doing, right? Like, they're trying to keep these zombie companies going by pumping fake fiat into them and by telling them, no, you can't shut down and you can't relocate and you can't do this and this is what you need to produce. And that stuff is technically right out of Hitler's playbook, which is what he did, is he put is the right to the Work Order Act, rather. He started appointing Nazi officials to all of the corporations to make sure that they were following lockstep with the state's designation for what they needed to produce and what they needed to do. So he's not obviously a Marxist, and he is technically more like a German National Socialist, even more so than a Italian fascist. Even though the Nazis still were more totalitarian than what they're doing right now, but it is all, like I said, economically, it's fundamentally the same premise underneath it all, where we have the state now taking seats at the board, in the boardroom, and the state managing and, kind of behind the scenes, though it's only behind the scenes because MAGA doesn't pay attention to actual economics. They're just, the illegal aliens, and then everybody got distracted by the war in Iran and Venezuela and all that stuff. So they're not paying attention to his economic policies. When I talk to the MAGA people about a lot of this on the internet anyway, and some of the people, I don't talk to many MAGA in real life, but the ones that I do, they don't really know about this stuff. So, because they're mostly distracted by the so-called illegal aliens. And now, it's this bizarre twist of propaganda, they're all talking about the communists are taking over. And it's like, dude, they're already in the White House, right? Like, Trump is a socialist. He's way more of a socialist than a capitalist. He fulfilled the role as a capitalist in the market largely through government favors, but right, he employed wage labor, he owned capital, yada yada yada. So he fulfilled that role, similar to Elon Musk. But when it comes to his policy and what he does through executive orders and the tariffs and all of this industrial policy, he's way more of a socialist, right? Because a capitalist, a free market like a Milton Friedman type person would not have the government start taking over ownership in corporations. That is that is the opposite of what we want. If these companies can't succeed in the market on their own merit and through providing quality goods and services, then they should be left to fail. And this, going back to when Obama did the bailout and everybody else, the Republicans pretended like they knew this. And what they've done is just they've kind of changed a few words and implemented it another way to where the Republicans can't seem to realize that it's all the same thing. And like another thing with his price controls on credit cards he keeps talking about. It's just a price control. And interestingly, when he first brought that up a couple years ago, he didn't say anything about only 1 year. Now it's going to be 1 year. But now if you look at that, it's kind of the same scam as the housing market and the mortgage scam. They pumped all this money out there. They started giving all of these subprime loans, and then they all switched to a higher rate. And then everything started collapsing because these people couldn't make that higher interest payment. And so what they're going to do is they're going to cap interest rates on credit cards, or at least what they're planning and discussing. They're going to cap interest rates on credit cards for 1 year and at 10%. And what that's going to do is incentivize people to put more on the credit card because they figure, well, it's only 10%. But then at the end of that year, when they've accumulated all that debt and it goes back up to the, whatever the worst could be, 27%, some people getting things like that, outrageous APR, they're not going to be able to pay that back. And then again, now the credit card companies are going to start coming after. You can't go to prison, but they can definitely put liens on things and stuff like that. So they're just running the same scams over and over and over again, but they change a few words and they implement it in different industries and they in a slightly different manner. And people, because they're so economically illiterate, historically illiterate, and intellectually lazy, they don't understand what is being done. And they think that Trump is some kind of capitalist hero because he goes up there and he pretends to bitch about communists. But in reality, he is way more of a socialist than a capitalist himself. So, yeah, these people have no idea what they're talking about. And it's honestly, it's frustrating to see this because, the country keeps slipping further and further into socialism, regardless of Trump. Trump has actually helped the socialists by implementing all of this nonsense industrial policy and setting the precedent to where the state can just start taking outright ownership in companies. And Obama set that precedent in certain ways as well, but it was obvious what he was doing the Republicans could see it and, oh, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. But when Trump does it, it's somehow against socialism. And that's the same thing. It's just different industries, different ways of implementing the same idea. So you guys need to study market economics. If you start at Chicago school, that's fine, I'd say, but you really need to study von Mises and F.A. Hayek and especially Murray Rothbard, because Donald Trump is not against socialism. Just because he uses the words that he says he's against socialism, he's not. He's not an enemy of socialism as such, right? It's just one gang of socialists fighting another gang of socialists. Just like a lot of the Republicans and conservatives can see that when it comes to the National Socialists and the Marxists, that, because the lefties, so-called, they always say, well, why did Hitler, jail all the Marxists and smash all the Marxist groups and things? The conservatives can see that doesn't mean that he wasn't a socialist, Hitler, that is. It just means that there's two gangs of socialists fighting over power. And that's all we have here now, too. And honestly, I think at the upper levels, up at the uppermost levels, they're not even fighting each other. It's just all a big show for people as the state continually expands its influence into the economy. Because Donald Trump has not removed state influence from the economy. If anything, he has increased it by leaps and bounds. And he has set the precedent now that the so-called democratic socialists and the Bernie Sanders which it's funny because Bernie came out and he supported Donald Trump's plan to take ownership stake in Intel. And at the beginning of June, Trump was talking with OpenAI to have the government take an ownership stake in there. And then Bernie Sanders unveiled his plan to take 50%. And all of a sudden now the conservatives are like, oh, that's crazy. Bernie Sanders wants the government to have ownership in the AI companies. And it's like Donald Trump was already talking about that several weeks prior. So it's interesting how many times Bernie and Trump actually line up. But these MAGAs are so ignorant to economics and philosophy that they can't see it, that Trump is a socialist. And of course, same thing goes for the so-called democratic socialists and the lefties, is they're also, I mean, obviously they openly consider themselves socialists, so they're probably a little bit more ignorant. That's why they hate, the only reason they hate Trump is because the television told them to. Because if they, at least I'll give Bernie credit in the sense that at least he studied Marx and he studied socialist philosophy and economics to where he can outright say, I agree with this plan from Trump. And why wouldn't he? Because that plan to have the government take ownership stake in these corporations is a socialist agenda. And so I give Bernie some credit in that sense, where at least he was studious. At least he actually studied Marx and he understands what the Marxist program is meant to be and to do. And that's why he can come out and say, I support this from Donald Trump and this, that, and the other thing. And yeah, he disagrees with a lot of stuff Trump does, but the fundamentals of the state taking ownership in these corporations, he does not disagree with, right? So that should give conservatives pause. Of course, they're just so hopped up on this illegal alien bullshit that and the fact that they just figured, I support capitalism and I've watched Fox News and Fox News talks shit about socialism, so that means I understand what I'm talking about. And it's like, no, none of you people understand what you're talking about at all. Because if you did, you would understand that Trump is much more of a socialist than he is a capitalist. And you would be opposing all of this nonsense that Trump is doing. And I got people on Twitter, when I post the meme I made of him with Karl Marx's quote of extending factories and instruments of production owned by the state, they're like saying I'm lying. It's like, what do you mean? What am I lying about? I don't know if they call me a communist. And it's like, dude, I'm not a communist at all. Like, you probably want more taxes than I do. So it's getting out of control. Like, they got this new scapegoat, communism, which they don't understand at all. Because if they really did understand it, then they would also oppose Donald Trump for his policies of having the government take ownership in corporations. Just because it's not totalitarian Marxism, it's 10% here, 5% there, a so-called golden share here, where he appoints people to the corporate board to have them follow the state's dictation. That doesn't mean it's not socialism. Okay, Trump is a socialist, same as. You guys just don't know what you're talking about.